Good Friday morning. Hopefully you can all hear me. Unlike the last one, I just want to make sure that I'm using the correct audio device here because the last time it was horrible. Yep, I'm using the right one. Perfect. Okay. Welcome to this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Um, this is where I share a lot of my experiences working with both my consulting clients as well as people who have gone through my training program. And you know how it is when you're trying to learn as much as you can. But the thing is, when people start looking at, hey, I don't have the right experience, I'm bringing the experience of people from all sorts of backgrounds, all from different environments, because again, it's if you're working in a one environment, for instance, there's not a lot of opportunities for you to explore stuff. Like, for instance, can I work on a different configuration, because you only have one, right? My goal is to bring you the experience of other people, as well as my own experiences, so that you can try it on your own. I mean, a lot of people have been asking, hey, how do you actually get that kind of experience if we don't get an opportunity to work on projects? Like, we're only part of operations, somebody else is building the environment. We just have to take good care of it. Good care is the key word. The thing is, you learn from other people's experiences and try to simulate them on your own. That's the fastest way for you to gain experience, instead of just waiting for a project to come in, or for you to be assigned to a totally different environment where you can take the lead on starting to design, implement, and manage always on availability groups. This topic, one of the reasons I decided to talk about this topic is because part of what I do as a consultant is to do assessment of environments, where I go ahead and look at, what's the health, what's the state of a specific always on availability group environment. And one of the things that I do is to stabilize an environment. The thing about this is, I get brought in for two reasons. One, there's a problem, needs to be fixed. Or number two, somebody else built it and they just want a second pair of eyes, and an expert validation to make sure that the environment is really fit for what they need. This topic, how to deal with a crappy environment that you just inherited, is something that comes up a lot during conversations with customers, with DBAs and sysadmins, where, okay, somebody else built the environment for them, or they're part of the operations team. The always on available group is already up and running. There's a totally different team taking care of the implementation, and they're just the one taking care of the monitoring and operational support. But then it's not as stable as they want it to be. There will always be challenges. Like, for instance, there are more tickets pertaining to X, and that X could be anything. It could be stuff like we're getting network timeouts between all of the replicas in an availability group. It could mean that we're getting outages at certain times within the day. What could be happening? It could mean all sorts of different things that would impact the availability and reliability and stability of the always on availability groups. And I use technical terms like crappy because in most most cases, that's actually what is happening. The people will inherit an environment. Somebody built it. It could be a managed services provider. It could be a consultant. It could be a senior DBA who built it and then left. Maybe he's up for retirement, built it, but then he left. He didn't hand over the environment properly. And a couple of days ago, I posted on my social media accounts how we technical professionals love documentation. Said no technical professional ever. We don't. In reality, we don't really like writing documentation. And so this is an opportunity for you to really deal with a, an environment that, number one, you have to be responsible for. You are now the caretaker of this environment. And so if you want, if you want to make life easy for you, you got to make sure that the environment is properly done, it's stable, it's reliable, it's highly available, and it's actually meeting the very objective or the very goal that you want. I've seen so many cases where the infrastructure was built to achieve high availability, not realizing that they experience more outages than even before they had that. And this is a side effect, again, of building an environment where people are not aware of what's at stake. Right? I've seen cases where you have a 4-node Windows Server failover cluster with a 4 replica availability group stretched across multiple data centers, and the goal was both for high availability and disaster recovery. But when they finally implemented it, they realized that the cluster was going offline more frequent than when they had standalone instances. And so it becomes a management and operations nightmare if you have to deal with a crappy environment. And the way I look at it is, just like just like a car. I'm using a car analogy. Just like a car, how do you expect to go to and from work with your car if your car's crappy? Meaning it's not functioning well, it breaks down right in the middle of the road, you're 20 minutes late, and then all of a sudden you have to deal with an overheating engine, who knows. But the thing is, again, if the infrastructure that you are managing is not even achieving the goal, meaning it's not serving its purpose, it's useless, right? You might as well just throw away the HA or the availability group or whatever type of HA solution that you have and just go with standalone instances, right? Again, if you have been given the environment and it is your responsibility to take care of it, you gotta know how to deal with it, because your sanity will be online. Especially when you're getting woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning because you got a page and you have to deal with an outage. You might be wondering, hey, wait a second, it's 3 o'clock, nobody's using. Well, the point is you have an availability group solution or high availability solution for that matter. So take notes. I always have this pen ready, part of my prop. I'm still old school. I write notes. I got a couple of notebooks lying around. The first thing that you need to do, and I actually have an acronym for this so that people can easily remember. It's called the ART. A stands for assess. Okay, assess the environment. This is where you start looking at every single piece of an always-on availability group or a failover clustered instance or any type of high availability solution. Was it built properly? I'm using an example of an availability group. You have to look at whether the failover cluster was built properly. In large organizations where you have segregation of duties, where you have your DBA team taking care of SQL Server and then the Windows team or sysadmin team taking care of the failover cluster, I've seen hundreds of times now where the Windows team would design the failover cluster in a way that is not consistent with what availability group needs. And this stems from the fact that they have done this in the past. And bringing in all of these old ideas, old knowledge, and I couldn't count the number of times that I've had to deal with an environment where it was a Windows team who built it, and they built it according to how they built it before. So they would provide shared storage, for instance, 3-node cluster with a storage area network. They will build it like that. And then when I asked them, so why did you build it like this? And they would say, well, that's how we've done it before. The thing is, you have to understand, again, if you're a sysadmin, you're taking care of the Windows Server failover cluster, you have to understand there are totally different requirements for availability groups than the traditional failover clustered instances, where in the past with failover clustered instances, you would need shared storage. With always on availability groups, you don't need to. And so when you think about that, you're now just that storage area network example, you are now provisioning or providing something that's not necessarily needed, something expensive that you have put in there, right? Like for instance, maybe your car, for instance, and I'm gonna go with the car analogy. You don't have air conditioning, and then you start putting in window type window type air conditioning systems on your car. Man, just get your air conditioning fixed instead of putting like 4 window type air conditioners on your car. And the thing is, because it's done that way in the past, they start to think, oh, it's how we would do it, right? Even in the days of virtualization, when you have VMware, Hyper-V, Citrix, or any type of virtualization, people who are taking care of the Windows infrastructure, the virtualization infrastructure, they would build the failover cluster in a way that they built VMs, right? There is no anti-affinity rules. There is no um, uh, concept of not over provisioning. And what ends up, not to mention thin provisioning, what ends up happening is that SQL Server will now rely on how that thing is configured. Availability groups will start relying on that. One typical example of a configuration that was done with virtualization in mind, but not looking at failover clustering and or availability groups, was VM snapshots. The VM admins have standardized on doing VM snapshots for their backups. And so I had a client from way back when where every 8 p.m., interestingly, 8 p.m., their entire infrastructure, available group infrastructure would go down. And this is a backend database for a large enterprise application that, good thing, they don't use after 8 p.m. And so it would take down the entire AG, it would take down the entire enterprise application, a blip for like 40 to 50 seconds, and then 2 minutes later, it's back online. And because the way the underlying infrastructure is configured, SQL Server now has to rely on that. The failover cluster now has to rely on that to a point where instead of providing real availability, it's causing more issues to a point where they're struggling figuring out what's going on. It took them like weeks to even find out what really is going on. But again, A starts for assess. Just assess. How is your availability group configured? How is your Windows Server failover cluster configured? Are these running on virtual machines or physical machines? If they're running on virtual machines, how are they configured? Are they configured with affinity or anti-affinity for all the failover cluster nodes? How is the backup being done for these VMs? And just doing a quick assessment, you easily figure out what is causing a lot of these issues that's causing you to have this crappy environment you have to support. Keep in mind, you have to do regular assessments. It's not a one-time thing and we're done. No. I used to think, oh, it's a set and forget thing. No. The reality is, even infrastructures like always on availability groups or any type of technology infrastructure, they evolve over time, right? You may add a new database, you may add a new replica, you may add a new node, but that's not necessarily another replica in an AG. You may add or configure a different witness. It will evolve, right? Of course, I don't expect it to change every week, because if it's changing every week, there's some problem over there. But it will evolve as part of how the business grows and how the business starts using these databases and these infrastructures, right? What might be a 2-node failover cluster with a 2-replica AG today might be, a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG in 6 months' time, because there's a demand for analytics, for reporting, that you now have to configure a 3rd replica as a read-only replica. But the point is, it will evolve, because it's just the nature of the business. So you got to include assessment as a regular part of your practice. Just like how you would take your car to a mechanic to do regular maintenance, oil change, filter changes, checking the tire pressures. Because you are using it on a regular basis, going to and from work, you got to have something that would put assessment as part of your regular maintenance, right? And if that, during one of your assessments, one thing is completely different from how you standardize your configuration, then you would have to do something about it, right? Um, uh, the term desired state configuration, popularized by PowerShell and just standardizing stuff, is there for a reason. If there's a drift or configuration drift from what you consider to be standard and what you consider to be something that you've considered as something that would stabilize the environment, you got to do something about it, right? The other part of the A, and I know I spend a lot of time on this because, again, you got to do the continuous assessment. The other A in this is awareness, because okay, so you do an assessment or somebody else does an assessment, right? You bring in a managed services provider or a consultant to do the assessment because you're not aware, right? What am I going to assess? What am I going to check? What am I going to? If you don't know, then you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know if, for instance, you're just driving your car to and from work. You wouldn't know that there's a problem until you kind of feel that there is a problem, and then you take it to the mechanic. But if you're not a mechanic, you just know that there's something wrong. It is affecting you as you go to and from work. In the same way with an availability group, you know that there's something wrong because, well, this is the kind of issue that we have to deal with day in and day out with all of our ticketing. Yeah, with all of your tickets. So you know that there's some problem. But unless you are aware of what it is that is the problem, then you just kind of guess. And typically what people do is this is the issue. This is the error message that I'm getting. I'm going to go on Google and start searching for error number, error message, certain setup, and then they would just take what. And sometimes they would post on Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange, any other forums available out there. Post their questions and expect, okay, this guy provided me with an answer. I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Again, unless you are aware of what is going on, what or how Windows Server failover clustering works, how always on availability groups work, how all of these things top to bottom work, a suggestion may just be a suggestion, but may not necessarily uh, um, be appropriate to our environment. That's why awareness is key to assessment. Because again, even if somebody else did the assessment for you, if you don't know exactly what he's talking about, if you don't, you just take it as it is. You gotta be aware, right? So that the next time around, you're gonna be doing your own assessment. And because you're aware of what configuration settings, what changes need to be made, then you can do that on a regular basis until you end up stabilizing the entire environment. So those are the two A's: assess and be aware. The second one, I said three. Second one is R. R stands for request. Why request? This is a high availability environment that we're looking at. You don't just go ahead and tweak something. I've seen people who would change the file share witness to something else just because. Oh, doesn't it's not going to cause any issues, right? Request is the process of you asking for permission to change something. Even if you think it's just a simple change that will not cause an outage. This is not about you just making changes for the sake of making changes. But again, the overall goal is to stabilize the environment. Now, even if it is changing a witness from a node majority to file share witness, you gotta ask for permission. It's not just about asking for permission because you cannot do what you need to do. It goes beyond that. Requesting, in fact, we use the term for in the change management world called request for change. And it's really not about whether your change will affect the environment or not. Sometimes, again, changing a file share witness, no big deal, right? No big deal. You can change the file share witness with a PowerShell code using the Microsoft Management Console for failover clustering. It's pretty straightforward. But it's not about that. Requesting for change, asking for permission to do that change is all about setting the right expectation. What do I mean by that? Let's say 100% changing the witness to a file share witness is not going to cause an outage, but you decide to do it at 9 o'clock in the morning when the transactions are starting up. You got like massive amounts of transactions coming in, and all of a sudden something went wrong. Guess who's going to get blamed for it? Well, the person who did the change. Setting the right expectation is really the reason why you are requesting for a permission to change anything. And in fact, this is one of the most frustrating piece of this, because it requires having the people skills in order for you to get the request that you are asking for approved. When I was working as a data center engineer, we would submit a request. Somebody would review the request. For instance, we engineers would submit a request for change. The engineering manager would evaluate, hey, what's the impact? What's the environment? What's the operating system? What's this and what's that? And then he would approve it. But he's just one person in the approval chain. What does that mean? Well, he has to ask the business stakeholders. We run a 24/7 operation, and all of our customers are all around the world. I can't just make the change at 3 o'clock in the morning Thursday, because 3 o'clock in the morning GMT plus 8, when I was working in Singapore back then, GMT plus 8 is 8 uh, 3 p.m. GMT minus 5, if I do my UTC calculations right. But the thing is, again, it's not just about you making the change. Even if the change has very, very low impact, we are simply asking for permission to set the right expectations. On the flip side of that, of course, we are trying to prevent stuff from actually happening. And when I say stuff, I mean, well, you want to prevent outages from happening, right? And so you're setting that expectation. And like I said, the engineering manager approving the change is just one piece of the whole approval chain. He needs to ask for permission from the business stakeholders, the department, the country who's responsible for that specific environment, for that specific server. And once that approval has been granted, that's the only time that we can get to do the change. And like I said, this is the most challenging part. Even doing the change is easy, but because you're dealing with people with different priorities, the request might take long. This is one of the reasons why most people are frustrated. Like, okay, I submitted this request last week, but the thing is, they don't understand. In our case, we schedule requests for changes over the weekend, because the weekend is kind of like all over the globe, while people on the other side of the globe might have a, I don't know, GMT plus 5 or GMT plus 8. Now is what, 10:30 p.m. uh, we would start on a Saturday, because that Saturday is practically Friday night. So we have that window where we share all over the world, we share the same weekend window. And so we would request for change. But however, when we submit a request for change, it has to be done before a Tuesday, our time, which happens to be Monday, North American time, so that we have enough time in order for the request to be reviewed, to be assessed, and finally approved. Because again, the whole approval chain needs to sign off. So if 1 out of 3 has not even signed off, we can't do the change over the weekend. We have to wait for another weekend in order for the change to be implemented. And this is the key. Like I said, it's not enough for you to just, hey, I know what I need to do. I have the request for a change and I need to get it approved, especially when you're dealing with mission critical systems. Now, I'm not talking about DevOps and all of that, because again, this is a mission critical system we're talking about. Any change that you would implement would potentially cause an outage, right? It's not like, yeah, I can replace this with a Docker container that you can swap in and out really quick and then roll back really quick as well. No, this is a mission critical, highly available system. So you got to be very careful, right? Now, requesting for change means, okay, you can go ahead and make that modification, right? Oh, the transaction log file for this database is growing and I need to shrink it down because, well, it's taking up a lot of space. And, you know, uh, even though I have this much transaction log file, I only need 10% of this because we provisioned and sized it properly. Unfortunately, whatever runaway query has caused the transaction log file to grow. Even that, shrinking the transaction log file, it may be a simple change as far as you're concerned, but we're simply setting the right expectation when you're requesting for change and an approval comes in, right? Of course, the people who approved of it knows that during that that time window that you're implementing the change, there could be some issues. An outage could happen, right? You may need to reboot the system. You may need to do something else. But at least everybody's on the same page about what the expectations are when you requested for that change. So that's the second one. The A stands for do an assessment and be aware. R stands for requesting for change. And T stands for tweak. I forgot which dictionary definition I got it from, but tweak is simply small changes. Tweak, not massive changes. This is a common practice when you're doing performance tuning, where you only change one thing at a time, because you want to make sure that whatever it is that you're changing is actually making a difference. And I'll just take this on a practical level. Even when you're making radical changes in your life, you want to lose weight, you want to achieve that goal, you got to start small, because if you do a lot of different things, you can get overwhelmed. But on the topic of availability groups and high availability solution, if you make a change and then you compile and combine all of these different changes all at once, you won't really know exactly what caused the change. Is it this tweak or that tweak? I'm using the file share witness example because it's a very simple example. But what if one of the cases that I worked on was they were having some issues with ghost cleanup tasks on the secondary replica. That's one. And they did a lot of investigation. They did not know. They made a lot of changes, but then it's still there. So how do you know which one is not actually contributing to that? And that's why you have to slowly do the changes one thing at a time, right? It's tempting because, again, we're kind of impatient as tech people. Given the technology, given the tools that we have, we need to get things done fast and quick. And it's frustrating when a simple change needs to wait for another week of approval, needs to wait. And it's frustrating. But here's the thing. If you start implementing all of the changes all at the same time, and then something goes wrong, you wouldn't know which ones to roll back, right? Because now you're thinking, okay, I've got 5 different changes here. Which one actually caused more issues? Okay. And that's why even when you are requesting for change, going back to letter R, even when you're requesting for change, you don't just request for all of the changes that you think need to be done. Okay. You got to evaluate which ones of these can I do that would not have a major impact. We call them the low-hanging fruit. We can change the setting. One client that I worked on, or one environment that I worked with on a client a couple of years ago, or a couple of months ago rather, is they have issues with network connectivity across different data centers, and they have a stretched cluster that their availability groups run on top of. And one of the things they started doing was they changed, the cluster heartbeat settings. But the thing is that really what you need to do? It turned out that when we started evaluating their network, they needed a faster network bandwidth. But they started making changes to those. And again, because you're doing one thing, you start to look at, okay, this configuration setting fixed the problem. No need to deal with the real root cause. That's why you have to slowly make those changes. You have to tweak one setting at a time and then measure. You got to have a baseline. This is what it looked like before the change. This is what it looked like after. And you have to make sure that you got the right metrics in place in order for you to really confirm, hey, this was the change, this was the before state, and this was the after state. And you got numbers to back it up, or performance metrics, or whatever kind of metrics that you have. Make sure that you don't implement changes much faster than you can measure. And again, being the technical professionals we are, we kind of have that, impatience of, hey, give me the numbers. But again, the numbers will only come over time, right? Especially if you're supporting a highly transactional database, and you know that a specific transaction based on the metrics that you've captured will only happen, let's say, end of the month, and you're only seeing the issues during the end of the month. So right now we're in the middle of the month, so you gotta wait until that time before you can even measure the before and after, right? And then you wait for another month to see if the problem really is there. Unless, of course, you have a really good way to emulate or simulate the actual workload in a production environment without affecting the production environment, which is kind of crazy sometimes. So those are the three things, actually four, that you need to do in order to deal with a crappy environment. Number one is do an assessment. A stands for assessment, top to bottom, from the ground up. If it's running on a VM, check the hypervisor. If it's running on a physical machine, check the hardware. If you're running on certain versions of Windows Server operating system, check the failover cluster top down, the Windows operating system, and finally the always on availability group or the SQL Server instance. And then based on that, you got to be aware. You have to do the assessment on a regular basis, and you also got to be aware, what is this assessment telling me? What is this configuration drift telling me? What is this thing going to do if I make this modification? Once you have a list of those things based on your assessment that you need to change, you now have to request for change, request for permission to make that change, and make sure that you're not implementing all of the changes at the same time. Hence, the T comes in, where you're tweaking one step at a time, one configuration change at a time, measuring the before and then the after in order for you to validate whether or not that change actually made a difference. And then document. Again, a lot of the times we don't like documentation. And so this is something that most technical professionals struggle with. Part of that is documentation, because again, even if you do the assessment, if you don't have a standard of what is stable, of what is considered to be reliable, if you don't have that, or if you don't have a best practices checklist, your own, Microsoft's recommendations, VMware, if you're running on VMware, if you don't have that, then you may run an assessment, but you're not aware of what it is that you need to change. Then what's the point? Even if you change something and it's not giving you the outcome that you test, tweak slowly, right? And this is the key to dealing with a crappy environment that you just inherited. Because the way I look at it is, people built this environment the way they know it is supposed to be configured. One of my clients said, well, our senior sysadmin built this and he left. It's a little bit crappy. And I said, no, he built it the way he thought was right. During that time, 4 years ago, it is exactly what you needed. 5 years later, your requirements have evolved. The business has grown. Whatever worked 4 years ago no longer works today. Maybe a few, but again, he built it with the way of thinking that this is what they need back then. Today's not back then. And so you got to constantly do the assessment. You got to constantly do the awareness of what it is that your business needs as far as the infrastructure is concerned, because you may have to request for those changes, and you may have to tweak the configuration setting to meet the business requirements. I mean, an always on available group with 5 databases, now that you've grown to like 2,000 databases, probably isn't the same always on availability group that you have to use. You may need to build multiple of them. And so these are the things that you have to constantly do in order to stabilize a currently crappy environment, right? That's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. And again, one of the things that you have to do is constantly do an assessment. And if you need help with doing an assessment, or just being aware of what it is that you need to do in order to do an assessment, if you have to deal with a crappy environment and you need to do it quick and fast, someone to come in and evaluate the environment, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's talk. Because again, instead of you dealing with this for like weeks and months now, it would be a lot better for you to bring somebody in that has done this multiple times and knows exactly what to look for, knows exactly what's wrong, and fix it immediately, right? Instead of waiting for like weeks and months and sometimes even years to fix the problem. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. right? And if there's anything I can do to help, I will. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help meet you best or help serve you best. That's about it for this week's episode. Tune in again for another episode next week, and enjoy the rest of your weekend if you happen to not be working on a weekend and not be on call. I say that especially when there's a long weekend coming up, or you know how it is with operational support. There's no such thing as a weekend. So make sure that you do take care of yourself first. Prioritize yourself. Do something you find fun, like something exciting, something fun. Do that. And I will see you again in the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Goodbye.